This is a tour of TaxSlayer Online for tax year 2021. Now I'd like to give you a little tour of TaxSlayer Online. I don't plan on getting into data entry because other instructors are going to be dealing with that, so I won't be showing you the data entry of W-2s or 1099s or any of that kind of thing. But I do want to go over some things that are unknown by many longtime counselors. There are some things that are very useful parts of TaxSlayer that are kind of hiding in the background that some people don't know anything about. So I'd like to introduce you to those things in particular. So here you can see the screen. So we've already logged into TaxSlayer. And so now we have the choice of either starting a new return or searching for an existing return. So I want to mention a couple of things about this screen. If you look over on the left-hand side, you can see that there are a lot of links to various places, the IRS website, different mailing addresses for the IRS, um, release notes for the various releases of TaxSlayer Online, VITA TCE publications and user guides, the VITA TCE blog, which is actually during the tax season, you're going to pay close attention to that because if there are problems with the software, the developers will put information on the blog. And so most of us pay very close attention to that during the tax season. There's also a suggestion box if you want to suggest making changes to the software. COVID-19 information, which hopefully over time will go away. We may not need that in the future. There's a speed test link. If you notice that things are running very slowly with TaxSlayer, you can do a speed test link to see whether the problem is with your computer or whether it's with TaxSlayer. There's also the Interactive Tax Assistant, which is also a very useful tool developed by the Internal Revenue Service for getting answers to lots of various questions. So you should get familiar with Interactive Tax Assistant. Probably not as useful during tax season because to get answers to questions, typically it does take a considerable amount of time. So our reference materials are probably a little bit quicker to get answers. There's a State Department revenue links. There's also the IRS withholding calculator. So if you look at the center of the screen, Welcome to Practice Lab, you'll notice that there's a message center, which we use sometimes during tax season to get messages back and forth to one another in the production environment at your particular site. So you can actually communicate with your fellow preparers, your fellow counselors using this tool. So it's sort of like an email facility that's centered around the tax preparation process. And also you can see rejected returns. So if there are any rejected returns, they'll show up there with a number. Hopefully there won't be any more than 0, but sometimes you may see a 1 or a 2 there. And so if you click on that, you'll see which returns were electronically filed and rejected and the reasons why they were rejected. So here you can either start a new return or you can search for an existing return. The point that I want to make here is that if you look off to the right, you'll see select. So the inclination is that if you want to use either one of these things, you're going to go to that box that says select. But the truth of the matter is it's not necessary. Once you go up here, you can actually click anywhere along this line and it will work. So you don't have to go all the way over here and hit select. You can just select it right from here. Okay, so here we notice that we can enter a Social Security number to create a brand new return. The Social Security numbers, in this case, the middle numbers are always zeros. And the reason for that is any practice returns cannot have numbers in those center two positions. So that differentiates a practice return from a real return. So any return that has 0 zeros in those slots means that it's a practice return and it will never get electronically filed. So it will never conflict in the production environment. Down below, you can see that there are various profiles that can be used to create tax returns, and I'll explain that. The default is basic, which is no profile at all. And so you can create a return without a taxpayer profile, which means you have complete control over what forms come up initially. And that's typically what we use all season long. We don't really use, at least at my site, we don't use these other profiles as much as probably we could. So the other profiles, such as the retirement, for instance, retirement, your site may want to set up a profile where a retirement return would automatically have the Social Security form come into the tax return, because everybody on retirement has Social Security pretty much. You would also have maybe 1099-Rs for retirement income. You may have one, you may have two of those. So you could set up a profile which is your typical retiree in your neighborhood or in your community. So when you would click on that as being the profile that you wanted to use, it would automatically bring up certain forms such as the 1099-R and the Social Security information, and you would just fill them in. And then if you didn't need two 1099-Rs, for instance, you could just delete the other one. But what we do at our site is we have no profile whatsoever. We start it with the basic, and we just add the forms that we need as we go. So that's enough on that particular thing. So I'm going to close that out. And then I'm going to go to client search. And again, anywhere along this line, you can click and it'll bring up client search. Okay, so here you can see that you can search for tax returns. Let's assume that you have hundreds of tax returns in your list at this point. You probably want to tailor your search and not just be perusing through them trying to find a particular one. So the thing that we usually do the most is we search for a client name, or we can search for a Social Security number, or even a part of a Social Security number. So you can pretty much put numbers or characters in this search client list where you can see my cursor blinking. I'm just searching for a name, Wilson, and it comes up with 2 tax returns by the name of Wilson. So you can also see that you can filter by status. So you can, I only want to look at the ones that are in progress, or the ones that are in review status, the ones that are complete. So you can restrict your search by the status or by any tags if your site happens to be using tags. Let's say there's a tag that says needs to be signed or whatever. You can just search on any tag. Well, here's some tags here. Let's look at the deleted ones or the incomplete ones. So you can search by that. You can also search by date and by date type. But what we do probably 99.9% of the time is a name or a Social Security number. So I found Wilson. The one that I want to select is Fred Wilson. And you can see that there's basic information like his phone number and his status, which is in progress. And here is a little bit of an exception to the rule where I said you can click anywhere along the line. Well, that's not true in this case. You do have to click on the word select when you're looking through this client list and making a selection. But you can do some other things from this client list too. You can also print the tax return right from here. So you can print the return. You can do a quality review. You can look at a quality review set. So there's a little printer here, and you also have tools. So if you wanted to know the client status, you could click on client status, and it would bring up the information about that particular client and whether it was e-filed, how much the refund was, and that kind of thing. So we'll leave that for now, and we'll go back here, and we'll select the Fred Wilson tax return. So the first thing that you get is the summary screen. So this return has already been started. And so there is a summary screen here, and you can see that on the 1040, Both of their names appear. It's a married filing jointly return. Both names appear, but there's not much of anything else on here. There's no income. So very little is done to this tax return, and that's okay because what I want to show you are very basic things and not so much the information that was input into the tax return, but a little tour of TaxSlayer Online and some of the various things that you may be helpful to you in the course of your in your tax preparation for the upcoming season. So the first thing that we notice is that we see the 1040. We also see the 1040 comes in a number of pages because there are 2 pages to the 1040. This is not the senior version of the 1040. This is the regular 1040, the standard version. So pages 1 and 2 are 1040, pages 1 and 2, and then you see Schedule 1 and Schedule 1 has 2 pages, Schedule 2 has 2 pages, Schedule 3 has 2 pages. So I'll show you these individually. So you can see Schedule 1. But before we go into various pages, there's also something called a summary view here. So you're looking right now at the 1040 view. Notice that it comes up in green. If I click on the summary view, you're going to see a view of pages 1 and 2 and the various schedules. And if data had been input into this tax return, you'd see the numbers over here on the right-hand side. But because there's no data, you're not going to see any numbers. So let's go back to the 1040 view. We can click on page 2. We can see page 2 of the 1040. And this would look exactly as the 1040 would look on paper. Page 3 is the Schedule 1, page 1 of the Schedule 1. And then we can go to page 2 of the Schedule 1. Schedule 2, page 1. Schedule 2, page 2. Schedule 3, page 1. Schedule 3, page 2. So that's the summary view of the tax return. And if we go back to page 1, that's enough said about that. Now you can also print the return. If you look up right here, it's called View, Print the Return up near the top. If you click on that, it generates a PDF file of the tax return. And once it creates a PDF file, you can print your 2021 tax return. Now, many people get misled by this. Because it says print your 2021 tax return, people think, uh-oh, I don't want to send this to my printer. Well, you're not sending it to your printer. When you click on this button, you're creating a PDF file, which you will then print from Adobe Reader or whatever other display, whatever other PDF viewer you're using. So if I click on this, it's going to come up and it's going to say, okay, where do you want to save this PDF file to? So I'm not going to continue with this because I really don't want to save the PDF. And so I'm going to go back and print results. And then I'm going to click on continue. Continue is like the enter key. When you click on continue, it basically saves the information that you have done thus far so that you don't lose it. And you could walk away from your computer and come back to it later, and that information would be there. But you have to be careful because if you're halfway through filling out a particular form and you leave your computer, the computer will eventually, the program will eventually time out, and that data that you've entered will be lost because you never hit the continue button. So that's view, print, return, and then right next to that is the prior year comparison. Prior year comparison can be very useful if you've got a tax situation where they came to your site last year, they're coming to your site this year, you've now completed this year's return, and you want to see how does this year's return compare to last year's return. This is an excellent way to find if there are any mistakes, because you can sometimes, if you look at the comparison between the 2 years, you have to wonder, well, why is this amount so different than it was last year? And then you can ask the taxpayer, is there any reason for this? And oftentimes you'll discover what the reason was, or you'll find out that there's a form that hadn't been entered, and maybe the taxpayer never brought it to the site and they should have. So they may have to leave the site, get the form, come back. So that often happens. So it's a really good tool. I highly recommend that you get in the habit of using it just about on every tax return, unless it's, of course, somebody who's coming to your site for the first time, in which case you're not going to have a prior year tax return to compare it to. So that's so much for the center of the screen. Now I want to go over to the left, and you're going to see along the left there is a menu of things. You're going to see the basic information for the tax return, the federal section, the health insurance section of the tax return, state section, the summary print screen. So this same screen that you're looking at, if you're not on the summary print screen, and you want to get to the summary print screen, you can get to it from here. Then you have e-files. So when you get around, when you finally have your tax return nearly done and you're wanting to e-file it, there's a lot of information that you have to enter under this e-file section before you can actually e-file. You can also do a 2021 amended return. So if you have a 2021 return that had a mistake on it or something where you had to amend it, this is where you would do it from. And then you have help and support. Don't worry about your office. Help and support you can use to try to get information on why TaxSlayer is not working the way it should, or why you can't do something. And then you can save and exit the return. So anytime you're done with the return or you're leaving the return to come back to it some other time, you want to click Save and Exit Return. You can get to it here, or if you look up in the upper right corner, there's also a Save and Exit up there. And I believe there's one at the bottom. No, there isn't. There's a Continue at the bottom, but there's no Save and Exit. So you got two places you can get to save and exit. One thing I wanted to point out up here is the form finder. Up in the upper left corner, form finder. Many counselors are not aware that that's there. And they're especially in your first year, you're going to think, okay, I've got this form that I need to input. Where do I put it? Well, let's say, okay, the form number says 1099R. Well, let's go to the form finder and just type 1099 first of all. Oh, wow, look at all the different 1099s. Okay, well, let's put an R after it and see what happens there. Aha, 1099R, distribution from pensions, annuities, retirement. So you can just select it from here, like so, and suddenly your 1099R form is there so you can input your data. So it's a very, very quick way of getting to a particular form, a blank entry form. So try not to forget that, because it's always something to fall back on. Even though you can get to income, notice the federal section here, you've got income, you've got deductions. You can go to the income section and select Form 1099R from the list, which is here, right here, 1099R. Or if you need to go to deductions, other taxes, payments. So all these different segments are there for you to select. None of these things I want to get into at this point, because you're going to be exposed to these things within the 6 weeks that you're going to be in training. So I don't want to step on any other instructor's toes at this point. So I wanted to point out the form finder, because that I think is critical, something you need to know. And so also up here at the top, you'll notice that the taxpayer's name is here, and you can look at some of these things. These are also things that a lot of tax preparers don't realize are available. You can get to scan documents, which doesn't really apply. We'd use that a lot during COVID, though, because we were not actually entertaining. We didn't have people coming live to our sites during COVID, so we were in fact scanning client documents into the system. We're probably not doing that as much anymore now that COVID is less of an issue, and a lot of our sites now are in fact taking live clients. There's also an Espanol section. So if you have somebody that's Spanish and you want to, and you're Spanish as well, you can do this whole thing in Spanish. There's a notes section. Here's the notes section. We highly encourage all of our preparers to make notes on their tax returns, especially when there's an unusual situation, so that if another counselor picks this up at a later date, or the local coordinator perhaps, they'll know exactly what's going on. Now, the note name is very restricted as far as how big a string you can put in there. So what we always recommend is that you put the date there and your initials, just the date and your initials under the note name, and then explain the note under the text section. And you can explain the note here. Again, you're somewhat limited, so you may have to put multiple notes. If you need to say something fairly lengthy, you're going to want to create more than one note on that subject. And you can also change the color, which is unimportant as far as I'm concerned. But then you're going to click on save to save the note, and it's going to be then a permanent part of this tax return. They can be deleted later if necessary. But notes are very, very critical in having somebody else understand what's going on with this tax return. So you can just click outside of that and it'll go away. I'm going to go back up to there, and there's also some helpful tools. For instance, there's a link to IRS publications, so if you need to get to Pub 17 or any other publication, you can get there through here. There's a basic calculator, which if you're in the middle of a tax return, you don't have a lot of people use their own personal calculators that they have on their desk. They usually bring them from home, or they have them in their purse or whatever. But so many counselors don't even know that this calculator is here. So just want to make you aware of it. And then we have quick file, and quick file I haven't spent a lot of time with, but it gives you the ability to, well, I don't know, it may not give you any ability at this point. So here we go. Know which forms you need. So that's what quick file is all about. You can play around with that on your own. We don't really use it at our site, so I'm not going to waste time on it. And then you have save and exit return again here. So you have it actually in 3 places. So that's enough said about what's at the top of the screen. Help and support is available here as well as down in the bottom left corner. So you can get help and support from multiple places. The other thing I wanted to mention is over on the right-hand side, there is a collapse menu. You'll notice that the return summary shows up over here. So if you're working on a tax return and the taxpayer happens to be looking over your shoulder and sees what's going on, these numbers over here, we'd rather in some cases not have the taxpayer actually see what's going on, because sometimes it looks like they owe money when in fact they don't, because we haven't finished the return yet. So if they see numbers cropping up over here, they may ask questions, they may get nervous. So we have this collapse menu feature up here. So you can collapse it down, and then you can always get it back if you need to. But sometimes it's actually, depending on whether the taxpayer is looking over your shoulder or not. Otherwise, I mean, you can just keep it up. But if they are looking, you might want to just hide that. So here you have the basic information: filing status, personal information, dependents, IRS identity protection PIN. Somebody will talk about that at some point in the future. The identity protection PIN is analogous to multi-factor authentication. So people, when you have an account online, the multi-factor authentication sends you a code to your cell phone. Well, this is a little bit different in that the IRS actually gives you a code prior to the time that we're doing the filing. And if you do not put that PIN number on the tax return at the time the tax return is filed, it'll have to be mailed in USPS, because electronic filing will not accept it without the PIN. So once you've asked the IRS for a PIN and they actually give you a PIN, that PIN better be on the tax return, otherwise you're going to have to mail it in. Here's the personal information screen. And notice I've entered everything in caps, but you could also enter it in lowercase. And what I wanted to tell you about that is that regardless of whether you enter your data in uppercase or lowercase, the tax return is going to print out in uppercase. So if you're concerned about how it's going to look on the finished tax return, the paper tax return, it's going to be uppercase regardless of what you do here. I typically always use uppercase anyway. I think it's just easier. Social Security numbers, you can enter the Social Security number. Well, you enter those in the previous screen, so you can't change them here. But also notice these various fields that have red asterisks beside them. Those are required fields, so those fields have to be filled in. Other fields, such as this one here, no asterisk, you could get by without putting anything in there. So the birth date, you can either select from a list or you can actually enter the number and then hit the tab key to go to the next field. I actually recommend that you enter the number rather than selecting it from the list. For instance, when you go over here to the date, to the year, I mean, you've got a big list. You've got to scroll up to select the number from this list. Takes longer than it would if you were just entering that information in there. So you could just go to your keyboard, hit the number 7, and then hit tab, and you would go over to this field, and then you hit the number 8, you hit tab again, and then you enter 1948. It saves you a lot of time rather than fishing through a list. So if you get in that habit, which is, I think, especially as you do your exercises, there are so many practice returns that you're going to be doing that I think if you get in the habit of just entering those numbers, you'll go through these practice returns in a lot faster period than you would otherwise. Now, you notice that there's a whole list of things pertaining to the taxpayer here that you need to possibly choose from. All I would suggest to you is that you make yourself aware of these various items associated with the taxpayer because they don't apply in most cases, but in some cases they do. And if they do apply, if you don't check the box when it does apply, the calculation of the tax is not going to be correct. So if any of these things apply to the client that you're working on at the time, you need to make sure that you check the box. And then the spousal information appears down here under the taxpayer. And again, same situation, you can enter the birth date or you can select it from a list. And there are things that apply to the spouse, again, that you need to be aware that these things are here. And if you do have a particular spouse that does meet one of these conditions, you need to make sure that those boxes are checked. And then you have the street address and the zip code. Again, the red asterisk showing which fields are required and which fields are not. And then when you're finished with that, you can just click on continue, and the continue button is going to bring you back to this basic information screen where you can then enter your dependents if there are any on your tax return. Also your filing status. In this case, it's married filing jointly, so you can select your filing status from here. One thing I want to say about over on the right-hand side, the filing status wizard, we recommend that you stay away from because there are some situations where the wizard actually does not give you the correct answer. They're pretty rare, but nonetheless, they do exist. And we are providing you other tools that will probably just as easy, if not easier, to find the filing status. So I'm going to actually get into the filing status this afternoon on the 11th, and going to do a presentation on filing status. So stay tuned for that. So I'm going to continue and go back, and I think that's probably about all I want to say because other information is going to be coming to you in the coming days, in the coming weeks. Other instructors are going to be going over the data entry for various forms. And so you're going to actually see the data entry screens and you're going to have a chance to do exercises that specifically exercise those particular topics that are going to be discussed. So that's it for now. I hope you enjoyed the tour, and we'll move on to the next subject.